At 14 September 1944, 0213 M Hill 400, Hürtgen Forest, Germany, the ground shook before the sound arrived. Then, the sound arrived. Deep, mechanical, relentless, tank engines. Growing louder by the second. Sergeant Dale Winters pressed his back against the frozen earth and counted. 1 engine, 2, 3. He stopped counting at 6. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. 12 American soldiers. 130 caliber machine gun with a bent feed tray, a single functioning radio with a cracked casing, and a battery that had been dying since midnight. And somewhere in the Black Forest below a German armored column, 2 full infantry companies and orders to retake this hill before first light. The question that would haunt the entire night wasn't whether the Germans were coming. They were already coming. The question was, why did these 12 men choose to stay? Hill 400 had no name on most military maps. It didn't need one. It was simply a rise of earth roughly 400 meters above sea level, sitting at the convergence of 3 forest roads cutting through the Hürtgen, a dark, claustrophobic stretch of German woodland that had been chewing up American units since mid-September. From the summit, you could see nearly 6 kilometers in every direction on a clear day. You could watch an armored column forming up in the valley. You could direct artillery onto crossroads that the Germans needed to move supplies and reinforcements toward the Siegfried Line. You could see the war unfolding below you like a chessboard, and you could ruin every move the enemy made. That was why it mattered. That was why both sides had already bled for it twice that week. The 28th Infantry Division's forward elements, specifically a 12-man patrol from Able Company, 1st Battalion, 112th Infantry Regiment, had taken the hill at 21:00 hours the previous evening. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance action. Get in, map the German defensive positions on the reverse slope, get out before dawn. Standard patrol doctrine. But Standard had stopped applying to the Hürtgen weeks ago. What Sergeant Dale Winters found when his patrol crested the hilltop was not a lightly held German observation post. It was the smoldering remains of one. The Germans had abandoned it in a hurry, 281 mm mortars still intact, 3 crates of German stick grenades, a stripped MG-42 mount with no gun attached, and a field telephone with a cut wire trailing off into the darkness below. Someone had left in a hurry. Someone had been chased off, or pulled back on orders, or both. Winters had radioed battalion at 2117. The message he received back was not what he expected. Hold the position. Reinforcements will push through by 0400. Do not abandon the hill. He read it twice. Then he looked at his 12 men exhausted, wet, running on maybe 14 hours of broken sleep across the last 3 days, and he told them what battalion had said. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, Private First Class Roy Callahan, 19 years old and from Knoxville, Tennessee, who had never once in 4 months of European combat been heard to complain, said quietly, "How many reinforcements, Sarge?" Winters didn't answer. He didn't know. And the radio battery was already reading low. What he did know, what every one of his men knew, was that the Germans were not going to leave this hill in American hands. Not with its view of their supply roads. Not with its mortar positions, not for a single night, let alone until morning. So Winters did what infantry sergeants do when the situation is impossible and the orders are clear. He started digging. The 12 men spread out across the hilltop with their entrenching tools and their cold hands, scratching fighting positions from the rocky, root-laced earth. Corporal James Hutch Hutchinson, the patrol's best shot, set up the .30 caliber at the hill's southern face, the most likely approach, following the widest road through the trees. Private First Class Eddie Morales and Private Thomas Bauer took the eastern flank, 2 rifles and 3 grenades between them. The remaining men filled in the arc, each position roughly 20 meters from the next, covering 270 degrees of possible approach. They left the northern face thin. There was a near vertical rock face on that side, 80 feet of exposed cliff dropping into a creek bed. Nobody was climbing that in the dark. Nobody sane, anyway. By 0130, they had positions. By 0150, they had checked their ammunition, and the results of that count were the first real moment of fear. Total rifle ammunition, across 12 men, approximately 340 rounds. 3 fragmentation grenades per man, except Morales, who had 2. The bent feed tray on the .30 caliber meant it jammed every 5th or 6th round under sustained fire. And the German mortars they'd found were useless without their firing pins, which the retreating Germans had taken with them. 12 men. A broken machine gun, 340 rounds. At 0204, Winters sent his last full radio transmission to battalion. He reported their ammunition status, their position, and the fact that he could hear vehicles in the valley below. At 0209, the radio battery gave its last breath of signal. At 0213, the tanks announced themselves. The ground shook. The sound arrived, and Sergeant Dale Winters, 31 years old, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 8 years in the Army, 3 campaigns across North Africa and Sicily, before France looked at the darkness below and understood something with absolute clarity. The Germans weren't going to wait until dawn to come for this hill. They were going to come now. The first probing attack came at 0231. Not tanks, not yet. Tanks don't lead on a forested hillside at night. They can't see, they can't maneuver through trees, and the noise they make announces their intentions to everyone within 2 kilometers. What the Germans sent first was a 16-man infantry section moving quietly up the main road in 2 columns, rifles at the ready, trusting the darkness to cover their approach. They were good. They moved without torchlight, communicating in hand signals and low clicks, keeping off the road's gravel center to avoid the crunch of stones underfoot. Under different circumstances, against a less alert defender, they might have walked right up to the American positions before anyone fired a shot. But Hutch was listening. Corporal Hutchinson had been on the Eastern Front before an injury had landed him in a replacement depot that shipped him to the 28th. He had learned things in Russia that no infantry manual contained. One of them was how to hear a man breathing in a forest when that man thought he was silent. It was something in the rhythm a trained soldier, walking carefully, still had a pattern to his breathing, a discipline that paradoxically made him more audible to someone who knew what to listen for. Hutch heard them at 80 meters. He didn't fire. He let them come to 60. Then 50. Then he opened up with the .30 caliber, firing in short controlled bursts to manage the feed tray, and the darkness below the hill's southern face erupted into screaming and confusion. The German section went flat, immediately disciplined, fast, exactly what trained infantry does, but flat doesn't help you much on an open road when a machine gun knows where you are. The firefight lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, the German section had pulled back, leaving 3 men behind who would not be pulling back anywhere. Winters moved along his line in the darkness, checking each man. Nobody hit. Ammunition count, down to approximately 290 rounds, plus the .30 caliber had jammed twice, and Hutch had cleared it both times. But the second jam had been worse. The feed tray was bending further inward with each cycle. It was 0241 in the morning. Clock reference, #1 hour and 19 minutes until the promised reinforcements. An eternity. The Germans did not wait long to answer. At 0255, the mortars started. Not German mortars from fixed positions, those would have been more accurate. These were American-made 60 mm tubes, almost certainly captured, operated by German crews who were good but not perfect in the dark. The first 3 rounds fell short of the hilltop by 60 meters, crashing through trees and throwing shrapnel upward at a useless angle. The 4th was close. The 5th hit within 15 meters of Bauer and Morales' position. Morales was uninjured. Bauer was not. The shrapnel caught Thomas Bauer across his left forearm and the side of his neck, not arterially fatal, but bleeding heavily in the way that neck wounds always do, and Bauer went down hard, pressing his hands to his own throat, while Morales screamed for the medic. The patrol's medic was Private First Class Luis Reyes, a 22-year-old from San Antonio who had wanted to be a pharmacist before the Army had other ideas for him. Reyes reached Bauer in 40 seconds, Moving at a crouch through the mortar fire that was now walking steadily across the hilltop, in a searching pattern, the German mortar crews adjusting their range, looking for the positions by sound and by the muzzle flash of the taut 30 caliber. Reyes packed Bauer's neck wound with sulfa powder and a compress, and the bleeding slowed. But Bauer was out of the fight. His left arm was nearly useless from the forearm wound, and the neck wound had left him white-faced and silent. The kind of silent that young men get when they suddenly understand in their bodies what before they only understood in their heads. 11 effective rifles. The mortar fire continued for 6 minutes, an eternity under fire, and then stopped. In the silence that followed, Winters moved from position to position, keeping low, talking to each man in a voice that was steady and calm, in a way that had nothing to do with how he actually felt. He had learned long ago that a sergeant's voice is a weapon. Panic travels down a line faster than a bullet. So does steadiness. "They're testing us," he told Morales, "trying to find where we are. Don't fire unless you have a clear target." "Sarge," Morales looked at Bauer, who was sitting against a tree with his eyes open, staring at nothing. "How long until long enough?" Winters said. "Stay on your sector." At 03:15, the second assault came. This time it was different. Not a single section on the main road. This was a coordinated push from 2 directions simultaneously. Roughly 30 men split between the south face and the eastern tree line, moving at a run once they hit the 40-meter mark, closing the distance too fast for the 30 caliber to engage effectively on both axes. They almost made it. Callahan was the one who stopped them on the east. He fired his M1 Garand as fast as the 8-round en bloc clip would cycle, dropped the empty, loaded a fresh clip, fired again. He wasn't aiming in the dark so much as aiming at sound and muzzle flash, and he hit 2 men and forced the rest to ground at 25 meters from his position. Then, he did something that nobody had told him to do, and that he would later struggle to fully explain. He stood up and threw all 3 of his grenades in rapid succession, one after another, the explosions walking across the tree line like a drumbeat, and the German section on the east broke and fell back. On the south face, Hutch held the road with the 30 caliber until it jammed for the 3rd time, then fired his pistol until the attack there also broke. The hilltop was still American, but the cost was climbing. Callahan had a grazed left ear from a near-miss round that had left him temporarily deaf on that side and bleeding down his neck. 2 other men had minor wounds, and the ammunition situation had become critical. Callahan was down to his last full clip. Several others had fewer than 20 rounds remaining, and Hutch's machine gun, after that 3rd jam, was now requiring 20 seconds of clearing between every burst. It was 03:26 in the morning. The German armored column that Winters had heard earlier was no longer moving, which meant it had stopped, which meant it was waiting. Waiting for the infantry to clear the top, Winters understood. The tanks don't move until the hill is clear. And somewhere on the other side of this forest, somewhere in the darkness behind them, an American battalion was supposedly pushing forward with reinforcements. Supposedly, the radio sat silent and useless in the dirt beside him, its battery deader than stone. A new sound drifted up from the southeast voices. German voices too far away to make out words, but audible. Multiple voices. And beneath them, the mechanical sound of something being assembled. Something heavy. Winters lay flat in his fighting position and listened, and in the listening he understood exactly what that sound was. They were setting up a heavy machine gun. An MG-42. The German answer to the American. 30 caliber, except faster, louder, and brutally more effective at sustained fire. Once that gun was in position and started its work, suppressing his defenders into their holes, the infantry would walk up the hill behind the fire and overrun the position room by room. He had perhaps 15 minutes before that scenario played out. 15 minutes, 11 effective fighters, and somewhere between 200 and 220 rounds of rifle ammunition. Private First Class Eddie Morales was the first one to say it out loud. He crawled to Winters at 0329 and crouched in the dirt beside him, and in a voice so low it was barely above a breath, he said, "We're not going to make it, are we, Sarge?" It was not a question. Winters looked at him for a long moment. Morales was 20 years old. He was from El Paso. He had a younger sister named Carmen, who he talked about constantly, and a mother who sent him tamales in care packages that always arrived, crushed and stale, and that Morales ate with absolute reverence regardless. He had been in the Army for 14 months. He had never once, in Winters' observation, shown the particular quality that the Army called cowardice. "That MG they're setting up," Winters said. "They need to move it forward once it's built. They can't fire it from down in the trees, the angle's wrong. They'll have to bring it up the road to the first bend, maybe 60 meters from Hutch's position." Morales watched him. "That means someone walks it up that road," Winters continued. "3 men, maybe 4. In the open, before they fire. You're saying we get one shot at the gun crew before they're set. I'm saying the gun crew is the whole problem. You take the gun crew, the infantry assault loses its suppression. They'll slow down. They'll hesitate." Morales understood. And then he understood something else. "Who goes?" Winters didn't answer. He was already looking back toward the south face. Clock reference, #203:31 am. 29 minutes until reinforcements were promised. 29 minutes that felt like a different measurement of time entirely. At 03:33, Winters made the decision that would define everything that followed. He assembled his men in the relative shelter of the hilltop's center, a shallow depression that offered 2 feet of cover, and he spoke for 45 seconds. No more than that. There wasn't time for more than that. He told them the situation clearly, and without ornamentation. The MG-42 was the threat, the gun crew was the target, and he needed 2 men to crawl out 60 meters from Hutch's position before the gun was emplaced, wait in the tree line, and ambush the crew when they moved the weapon up. It was not an order. He was explicit about that. It was a request. Callahan volunteered before Winters had finished speaking. The second volunteer was the one nobody expected, Thomas Bauer, still white-faced and compressed, his left arm strapped to his chest, who got to his feet and said, in a voice entirely devoid of dramatics, "I can still pull a trigger." Winters looked at him for 3 full seconds. "Take 4 grenades," he said. What happened on that slope in the next 11 minutes was not witnessed by anyone who survived with full clarity of detail. Callahan and Bauer crawled down 60 meters of rock and root and cold pine needles in the dark, moving on 1 arm and 2 knees in Bauer's case, and they found a position in the tree line off the left shoulder of the road. They waited. The sounds from below, the metallic assembly sounds, the German voices grew louder and then began to move. The MG-42 crew was coming up. 4 men, carrying the gun in parts, moving carefully because they believed the Americans on the hilltop were pinned down and outmatched and largely done. They were incorrect. Callahan fired first, with his last clip. Bauer threw all 4 grenades in a sequence that put them exactly where they needed to go. In the space of 14 seconds, the MG-42 crew ceased to exist as a threat. What nobody had discussed, what Callahan realized only as he was already doing it, was that getting back up the hill in the aftermath was going to require crossing 30 meters of open ground, while every German soldier within earshot understood exactly where the American ambushers were. Callahan went first and made it. Bauer came second, moving slower, his wounded arm dragging, and he was hit again, a clean through and through in his right thigh that put him down 10 meters from the hilltop perimeter. Morales went and got him. Nobody told him to. He simply went. Both men came back. The Germans, for 7 full minutes after the ambush, did not advance. The loss of the MG crew created exactly what Winters had predicted: hesitation, confusion, the specific paralysis that infantry experiences when a key piece of their plan is violently removed. But 7 minutes was not enough. Not nearly enough. At 03:47, the third and largest assault of the night began, and this one had everything behind it. 50-plus infantry, moving on 3 axes south, east, and now the northeast, pushing through a section of trees that Winters had believed was too dense to move through quickly. He had been wrong about the northeast. The Germans had found a path through. And with 50 men and a second MG crew that had evidently been held in reserve, they came up the hill with a coordination and violence that made the previous 2 assaults feel like exercises. The American line, already stretched thin across 12 positions now held by 9 effective fighters, began to bend. Winters made a decision that was not in any field manual and was not the product of any training he had received. He told his men to fall back to the hilltop center, the depression, where they had assembled 20 minutes earlier, abandoning the perimeter entirely, contracting to a single tight position no more than 15 meters across. On the face of it, this seemed like suicide. A smaller perimeter meant less space, less separation, more vulnerability to grenades. But Winters had noticed something about the 2 previous assaults. The Germans were cautious about advancing into unknown defensive positions. They moved carefully once they thought they might be near the Americans. They fired ahead of themselves, checking for return fire before committing. They were professional soldiers, and professional soldiers don't waste lives rushing unknown positions in the dark. If they thought the hilltop was more heavily defended than it was, they would slow down. Winters told Morales to take the dead German flares they'd found in the abandoned op and set them alight in the outer positions, the ones they'd just abandoned. Spread out. Make noise. Create the impression of defenders in multiple positions across the entire hilltop. It was the oldest trick available to an outnumbered defender. And it worked. The German assault force, pushing uphill through the dark toward what they had been told were 12 Americans, started seeing movement and light in positions spread across 200 meters of hilltop. Their fire spread accordingly, shooting at flares, at movement, at the ghost of a defender in every hole. They slowed. They called for guidance on the radio. They spread their attack to cover the apparent breadth of the defense, and in the center, 9 men in a dirt depression held their fire and waited. But the deception could only last so long. The flares burned out. The movement stopped. And the German assault leaders, cautious but not stupid, began to understand that something was wrong. The Americans were not returning fire across their perimeter anymore. The resistance had contracted. At 03:59, a German officer's voice cut through the firefight from somewhere on the south slope, not close enough to see, but close enough to hear, and what he said, in German, translated roughly as, "They've pulled back to the summit. All units advance." Winters heard it. He didn't speak German fluently, but he'd picked up enough in 3 months on the continent. He looked at the 8 men beside him in the depression. They looked back at him. "Hold fire until 30 meters, he said. The ammunition across all 9 effective fighters at that moment amounted to approximately 65 rounds and 4 grenades. The German force coming up the hill numbered in excess of 40 soldiers. 9 men. 65 rounds. 40 German soldiers in the dark. The math did not work in any language. And then the German assault stopped. It stopped because of a sound, not from below the hill, from behind the hill. From the northeast, the rock face, the cliff that Winters had judged unclimbable in the dark, that he had left undefended, because no sane man would attempt it at night. The sound was rifle fire. American rifle fire, distinctive in its timing and cadence, M1 Garand cycling, the sharp crack of carbines, and underneath it all, the grinding diesel sound of half-tracks. Reinforcements, but not from the direction they were supposed to come. Not down the forest road from the American rear. From the cliff face, which meant the relief column had not come the direct way they had swung wide, found the creek bed at the base of the cliff, and climbed. Clock reference tag 3:04:02 2 minutes past the promised deadline. The relief column had not been late. It had been coming a different way. What happened on that hillside in the next 4 minutes was violence too compressed to untangle cleanly in retrospect. The German assault force which had been moving uphill toward the American center, was suddenly receiving fire from behind and above from the cliff face, where the relief company, approximately 60 soldiers from Able and Baker companies combined, had crested the rock face in the dark using ropes and sheer nerve. The Germans were flanked. The hammer that had been pressing them uphill against the American 9 suddenly had an anvil appearing at its back. For the German assault force, this was not just a tactical problem. It was a psychological catastrophe. They had spent 2 hours moving against a position that their reconnaissance had estimated as a dozen lightly armed men on the verge of collapse. They had lost a machine gun crew and taken casualties in 2 failed assaults. Their armored column sat useless in the valley below, waiting for a hill that never quite fell. And now, at the moment they had finally cracked the perimeter and were pressing toward what they believed was the final position of a spent and desperate handful of Americans. The Americans hit them from a direction nobody had defended. The German assault broke. Not slowly, not with measured retrograde movement, it broke the way units break in darkness when flanked and confused, which is to say quickly and in pieces, men going to ground, calling for direction, losing cohesion with each passing second. But what happened in those 4 minutes was not the most important thing that happened that night. The most important thing happened before the relief column's first shot was fired. Somewhere on the south slope of Hill 400, a German Hauptmann, a captain, commanding the lead infantry company in the assault, had paused his advance. The pause was not authorized. He had paused because, after nearly 2 hours of fighting against what his intelligence had described as 12 men with minimal ammunition, he had run the numbers in his head, and they made no sense. He had launched 3 assaults. He had committed 1 machine gun crew. He had expended perhaps 800 rounds of rifle ammunition in probing and suppressing fire. He had taken 11 casualties, 3 dead, 8 wounded against 12 American soldiers who had no resupply, no functioning radio, and no reinforcement. In his field notebook, later recovered, he had written 3 lines before the relief column arrived and ended the engagement. The first line was a count: 12 men, 6 hours of darkness, 3 assaults repelled. The second line was a question: how? The third line, written with the pressed hard pen of a man who has understood something and does not want to understand it, was: they should have been gone at 0300. They were supposed to break. Why didn't they break? Because what this German officer had encountered, what his company had spent 2 hours running against, like a wave against a breakwater, was not just tactical competence. He had expected tactical competence. American soldiers were not underestimated in the same way they'd been in 1942. By September 1944, the Wehrmacht knew that American infantry was capable, well-equipped, and hard to break. What he had not expected was this: the particular quality that makes a soldier refuse a reasonable calculation. The reasonable calculation on that hilltop, as of 01:30 in the morning, had been obvious. 12 men, limited ammunition, no radio, overwhelming force approaching. The correct outcome, by any rational tactical accounting, was to withdraw before the Germans arrived in strength, give up the hill, and live to fight from a prepared position elsewhere. The math pointed to one answer. Winters and his 11 men had looked at the math and chosen a different answer. The German captain had spent 2 years fighting on the Eastern Front and nearly a year in France. He had seen fighting retreat and fighting advance and fighting delay and fighting everything in between. But this specific quality, the willingness to accept an impossible calculation and refuse its conclusion, was something he associated with his own SS units or with certain Fallschirmjäger formations, not with what his intelligence had described as a routine infantry patrol. In his notebook, below the 3 lines, he had added one more word. The word, in German, translates most directly as inexplicable. He meant it as frustration, but it was, in its way, a form of admiration. The relief column came over the cliff at 04:02. The German assault broke at 04:06. The hill was secure, at 04:14. In the chaos of those 12 minutes, the German captain's notebook ended up in American hands. It was read by a young intelligence officer from battalion who translated it and passed it up the chain, and eventually it reached a staff officer who added it to the after-action report with a notation that summarized it simply: enemy commander expressed tactical confusion at pace of American resistance given force ratio and ammunition status. The words don't carry the weight the German captain had put into them, but they are, in their dry military way, the only official record of what one professional soldier thought when he looked at what 12 Americans had done on a cold hilltop and admitted to himself, in the dark, before anyone arrived to change the outcome, that he did not understand it. The relief column's arrival did not end the fighting, not immediately. The German assault may have broken, but broken units don't disappear. They fragment, take cover, and fight from wherever they land. For 11 minutes after the first American reinforcements crested the cliff face, the hilltop was a close-range, fragmented, pitch-dark engagement in which identifying friend from foe required shouting passwords, while muzzle flashes made temporary daylight of the tree line. It was in those 11 minutes, those final, grinding, ugly minutes, that the night took its last price. Sergeant Dale Winters was directing fire from the hilltop center when a German soldier, separated from his unit and moving on instinct through the dark, came over the lip of the depression at a run and discharged his rifle at 2 meters range. The round hit Winters in the left shoulder, spinning him back into the dirt. He went down hard, losing his rifle, and for 3 seconds he lay looking up at the pre-dawn sky through the pine canopy while the sound of the firefight continued around him. 3 seconds. Then he got up. He retrieved his weapon with his right arm. He called his men to consolidate. He directed the relief company commander, a Lieutenant Morris, who had arrived over the cliff face with 60 men, and the specific expression of someone who had not expected to find anyone still alive, to sweep the southeast quadrant where the German remnants had concentrated. Winters directed the sweep from the depression. Sitting in the dirt with his rifle across his knees and a compress pressed against his shoulder by Luis Reyes, who had been treating wounds for 2 hours straight, and whose hands had stopped shaking sometime around the second assault, which is what combat does to some men, it uses up the shake. At 04:19, the hilltop went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of an undisturbed place. The quiet of a place that has been violently emptied, the particular silence that comes after sustained rifle fire, when the ear is still ringing, and every sound that remains feels too loud by contrast. The creak of a pine branch, the drip of water somewhere, someone breathing in short controlled gasps that were not quite steady yet. Lieutenant Morris stood at the hilltop's edge and looked down the south slope where the German assault had come from, and did the count that every arriving commander does, the count that tells you what the situation cost. 9 American soldiers moving under their own power. 2 who needed immediate evacuation: Bauer, who had been shot twice and was now the color of old paper, and Callahan, whose second wound was more serious than he'd represented it. 1 dead, Private First Class Daniel Okonkwo, from Detroit, who had been killed in the third assault and who lay covered with a field jacket at the edge of the depression where Morales had placed him. 1 dead, 6 wounded to varying degrees, 9 still standing. Against more than 50 German assault infantry, an MG crew, and an armored column that had never been able to deploy. Morris looked at Winters, who was sitting in the dirt with a hole in his shoulder and the expression of a man who has spent 7 hours being afraid and has come out the other side of it into a kind of exhausted clarity. "How long were you up here?" Morris asked. Winters told him. Morris said nothing for a moment. "Then," he said, "Battalion wanted to know why you didn't pull back." Winters considered this. The sky above the pines was beginning to pale, not light yet, but the specific darkness that precedes light. The darkness that knows it's about to end. "Hill 400, Winters said finally. "From up here you can watch everything they're doing in the valley, every column movement, every supply run." He paused. We pull back, they get it back. They get it back, we're blind for a week. Minimum, Morris nodded slowly. That why your men stayed? Another pause. Longer this time. They stayed because I told them we were holding until 0400, Winters said. And they believed me. He looked at the pale sky. That's really it. That's the whole thing. It wasn't, of course. It wasn't the whole thing at all. The whole thing included Callahan going down the slope in the dark, Bauer dragging himself back up it, Morales going out to get him, the flares burning in empty positions, 65 rounds stretched into something that shouldn't have lasted, all the invisible calculations that men make in dark places, the ones that don't appear in after-action reports, because there's no language in military bureaucracy for the specific choice to refuse the reasonable outcome. But Winters didn't say any of that. He wasn't built for that kind of saying. At 0447, the medevac carriers arrived at the base of the hill. Bauer and Callahan were carried down first. Winters refused evacuation until every other casualty had been moved, which Morris documented, and which eventually contributed to the commendation that Winters received 6 weeks later, and that he accepted with the same economy with which he did everything. The other 9 men of the original patrol were rotated back to battalion that morning for rest and resupply. Hill 400 remained in American hands. From its summit, over the next 11 days, American artillery observers directed fire that disrupted 3 German resupply columns, eliminated 2 reinforcement movements toward the Siegfried Line, and contributed in ways that were never precisely quantifiable, but that staff officers could trace in the patterns of German supply logs captured later to the shape of the entire Hürtgen campaign through October. None of that was visible on the hilltop at 0447 in the morning on September 15th. What was visible was simpler. The sky above the Hürtgen Forest, turning from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a cold autumn sunrise, the pines throwing long shadows east, and the rough earth of the hilltop's center, the dirt depression, where 9 men had sat with 65 rounds and watched the numbers not add up and decided to stay anyway. Reyes was the last one to leave the hilltop. He stood for a moment at its crest, looking down the south slope, where the night's work lay in the usual aftermath form: discarded weapons, torn earth, the evidence of what men do to each other, and then he looked east at the sunrise. He was 22 years old. He had wanted to be a pharmacist. He thought about Okonkwo, who had wanted something too, though Reyes couldn't remember now what it was. Detroit. A girl. A car. Something ordinary and specific in the way that everything particular to a man becomes when that man is gone. He thought about Bauer, who would probably lose full use of that left arm. He thought about Callahan, who would be fine eventually, who was already complaining on the stretcher, and would therefore definitely be fine. He stood there for 30 seconds, looking east. Then he went down the hill. So here's the answer to the question that opened this story. Why did 12 American soldiers choose to hold Hill 400 knowing the Germans would arrive before dawn? The strategic answer is what Winters gave Morris. The hill controlled observation of the entire valley, and losing it meant losing visibility on German movements for days, and in the Hürtgen in September 1944, days were worth lives in the currency of information. But the strategic answer is not the real answer. The real answer is this. Sergeant Dale Winters looked at 12 tired men in the dark and told them to hold until 0400, and they believed him enough to do it. And he believed something too, that they could hold, that the position could be defended, that the math was wrong, and the human factor the math doesn't account for was in their favor. Military historians call it unit cohesion. Psychologists call it collective efficacy. Warriors in every language and every century have called it something simpler. They call it trust. The men on Hill 400 were not supermen. They were not selected for this task. They did not have better equipment or better training or more ammunition than their counterparts. They were 12 men from ordinary American cities and towns, cold and exhausted and scared in the dark, with 65 rounds between them and a broken machine gun and a radio that had stopped working. What they had, the only thing they had that made the difference, was each other. And the particular stubbornness that comes from deciding, when the numbers point one way, to point yourself the other. The German captain, who wrote inexplicable in his notebook, was wrong in one sense and right in another. It was inexplicable to him because he was running calculations, but there are things in human beings that don't run on calculations. Things that survive the math. Hill 400 was just a rise of earth. It had no name before that night, and it had no name after. It was 400 meters of rock and pine and frozen ground. But for 7 hours on a September night in 1944, it was the most important piece of ground in the world to 9 men who had decided it was worth whatever it cost to keep it. That is why they stayed. That is why the hill held. And when the sun came up over the Hürtgen Forest on the morning of September 15th, cold and gold and indifferent to what had been done in the dark beneath it, the hill was still there. And so were they.